2 months after the Spencer mansion, Jill Valentine was still in Raccoon City. She had evidence of what Umbrella had done. She had testimony. She had everything a criminal case needed and nowhere to take it, because the chief of police was on Umbrella's payroll and every report she filed disappeared. On the evening of September 28th, 1998, Umbrella decided she had been alive long enough. What followed was 72 hours that ran parallel to, through, and past the events of Resident Evil 2. Jill was fighting her way across the city, while Leon and Claire were still on the highway. This is the complete story of that 72 hours, every confirmed event in order, and every character who mattered. The full picture of what Resident Evil 3 actually was. Following the destruction of the Arklay mansion in July 1998, Jill Valentine remained in Raccoon City to conduct a private investigation into the corporate facilities of Umbrella. While her colleagues Chris Redfield and Barry Burton departed for Europe to strike the organization at its headquarters, Jill stayed behind to gather internal evidence. She utilized her tactical experience to monitor the municipal leadership and the suspicious movements within the local laboratories. This solitary mission was a dedicated attempt to secure justice for the fallen STARS members. Jill's isolation allowed her to observe the subtle signs of the coming disaster that the public ignored. She documented the increasing reports of strange disappearances and the unusual activity at the municipal water treatment plants. During this period, the city's social order remained superficially stable, but Jill understood that the biological rot was already spreading beneath the streets. She maintained a high state of readiness, keeping her equipment organized for immediate departure. The 2 months of silence were a tense preamble to the total collapse of the urban center. The investigation became a race against the invisible enemy as the organization utilized its political influence to discredit the mansion survivors. Jill found her movements restricted by the corrupt leadership of the RPD, who viewed the STARS unit as a liability. She was forced to operate in the shadows, utilizing a network of contacts to track the viral shipments. The isolation reinforced her distrust of the municipal authority, making her an independent actor in a city that was being systematically poisoned. Her apartment became the tactical hub for a one-woman resistance. In late September, the situation reached a critical mass when the city's water supply was contaminated with the T virus. The resulting outbreak was rapid and unmanageable, turning the suburban population into a necrotic swarm within 48 hours. Jill found herself trapped within the downtown district as the police barricades failed and the emergency services were overwhelmed. The evidence she had gathered was now secondary to the objective of physical survival. The city had transformed from an investigation site into a biological trap. The transition from a silent observer to an active survivor occurred as the social infrastructure dissolved into total anarchy. Jill realized that the organization had successfully sacrificed the city to protect its research data. The lack of outside intervention suggested that the perimeter was already sealed by the military. She was a veteran of the first outbreak who was now caught in the center of the second. The silence was over, and the prehistoric fire was consuming every street in Raccoon City. On the night of September 28th, Jill received a frantic telephone call from her former teammate, Brad Vickers. The pilot's voice was characterized by a primal terror that signaled a shift in the nature of the outbreak. Brad warned Jill that a specialized hunter was moving through the city with the specific intent of liquidating the remaining STARS members. This was her first confirmation that the organization was actively cleaning house. The warning call was the sound of the professional brotherhood being systematically erased. Brad's intelligence was based on his own narrow escape from an encounter in the downtown district. He described a creature that possessed a focused intelligence and an unyielding aggression that surpassed any common zombie. The pilot realized that their status as witnesses made them the primary targets for the corporate cleanup operation. He urged Jill to flee her apartment immediately, and as the predator was utilizing the unit rosters to track its prey, the phone call was a final act of loyalty before the total failure of the municipal network. The warning forced Jill to reassess her tactical situation within seconds. She understood that the organization had deployed a biological asset specifically designed to terminate elite human targets. The city was no longer just a zone of infection. It was an active hunting ground for a superior predator. Jill prepared to abandon her investigation materials to focus on the immediate retreat. The reality of the Star's liquidation was a clinical proof of the company's absolute ruthlessness. This interaction provided the necessary catalyst for Jill's departure from her sanctuary. She recognized that the silence of the last 2 months had been a calculated window for the organization to prepare its countermeasure. Brad's frantic message was the only tactical advantage she possessed in the environment that was already compromised. The warning call was the bridge between the investigation of the past and the survival of the present. The nightmare was moving toward her front door. As the call ended, the sounds of structural destruction reached the apartment hallway. Jill realized that the time for planning was over and the time for movement had begun. The pilot's warning had saved her from an immediate assassination, but it had also confirmed her status as a marked woman. She took her weapon and moved toward the exit, leaving behind the evidence of a failed legal battle. The warning was the official start of her 72 hours of horror. At 8:07 p.m., the quiet of Jill's apartment was shattered when the Nemesis smashed through the structural wall. This sudden breach was a clinical demonstration of the creature's power and its knowledge of Jill's location. The predator utilized the surprise to initiate an immediate chase, forcing Jill to navigate a burning building that was rapidly losing its integrity. The apartment was no longer a home. It was a compromised kill zone. Jill was forced into a frantic retreat without the opportunity to gather her full tactical kit. During the escape through the crumbling hallways, Jill was forced to abandon several essential items, including her customized samurai edge handgun. This loss was a significant tactical setback, as the weapon was specifically tuned for her professional needs. The chase moved from the interior rooms to the external fire escapes as the building was consumed by flames. The Nemesis followed with a mechanical persistence, ignoring the environmental hazards to maintain its line of sight. The pursuit was a visceral introduction to the creature's mission parameters. The downtown streets were already in a state of total anarchy when Jill reached the pavement. The fires from the apartment block illuminated the necrotic swarms that were claimed by the T-virus. Jill found herself caught between a relentless super soldier and a city of the walking dead. The social order had been replaced by a primal struggle for space and survival. Every alleyway was a potential bottleneck where the Nemesis could corner its target. The loss of the samurai edge symbolized the end of Jill's role as a police officer. She was now an independent survivor who had to utilize whatever discarded weaponry she could find in the wreckage. The apartment attack proved that the organization possessed the means to strike at any target with absolute force. The Nemesis was a biological enforcer that operated outside the laws of nature and the rules of the city. The chase was the first test of Jill's physical and mental endurance. Narrowly escaping the burning building, Jill moved into the dark heart of Raccoon City. She realized that the creature was not a mindless beast, but a professional hunter that would never stop. The city was a biological incinerator, and she was the primary fuel. The apartment breach was the moment the scale of the corporate betrayal became personal. The night of the 28th had officially begun with a wall of fire and a broken home. The Nemesis was a biological masterpiece developed by the European branch of Umbrella. It was built upon the foundation of a T-103 Tyrant, which provided a durable and powerful host body. However, the defining characteristic of this model was the implantation of the NE-alpha parasite. This parasitic organism functioned as a secondary brain, taking control of the host's nervous system to enhance its cognitive capabilities. The result was a super soldier that possessed enough intelligence to follow complex tactical orders. The NE-alpha parasite allowed the Nemesis to bypass the mental stagnation usually seen in tyrant models. It could recognize specific faces, operate heavy weaponry, and adapt its tactics based on the behavior of its target. This intelligence made the creature the most advanced biological weapon in the corporate catalog. The organization utilized the Nemesis to fulfill a singular mission: the total tactical elimination of every STARS member. The Predator was a clinical solution to the witness problem created by the mansion incident. Jill Valentine was designated as the primary target due to her high combat proficiency and her extensive knowledge of the corporate secrets. The Nemesis was programmed to ignore other survivors unless they interfered with its mission to terminate Jill. The creature moved with a mechanical focus, she utilizing its superior physical attributes to overcome any obstacle. The parasite acted as a tactical leash that kept the tyrant's aggression directed toward a specific objective. It was a biological god with a corporate contract. The physical design of the Nemesis included a reinforced limiter coat that suppressed its secondary mutations while providing ballistic protection. It also featured several biological tentacles that could be used to infect or restrain targets from a distance. The organization monitored the creature's performance through an internal data link, recording its efficiency in an urban combat zone. The Nemesis was the definitive proof of the organization's lead in the global biological arms race. It was the Reaper of the elite. The combination of the tyrant host and the NE-alpha parasite created a being that was nearly impossible to terminate with standard police equipment. It possessed a regenerative ability that allowed it to survive explosions and high-caliber gunfire. The Nemesis was the ultimate realization of the prehistoric fire, a creature that merged the power of the virus with the intelligence of a predator. It was the shadow of the pharmaceutical giant falling over the last days of the city. Jill was fighting an enemy that was designed to be her end. Jill encountered her former teammate, Brad Vickers, at Jack's bar during the early hours of the outbreak. The pilot was in a state of terminal despair, having already been bitten by an infected citizen during the chaotic evacuation. Brad had accepted his fate, realizing that his tactical caution in the mansion had not saved him from the urban rot. He told Jill to save herself, recognizing that his own journey was reaching its biological conclusion. The encounter was a visceral reminder that the city was a graveyard for every professional officer. Shortly after their meeting, Brad was cornered by the Nemesis in a narrow alleyway. The creature recognized the pilot as a STARS member and initiated an immediate execution. The death of Brad Vickers was a clinical demonstration of the Predator's mission parameters. He was eliminated with a total lack of empathy, his body used as a biological resource for the creature's data collection. The pilot who had fled the mansion had finally been caught by the corporate Reaper. His death proved that nobody was getting out clean. The loss of Brad was a significant psychological blow to Jill. He was the last connection to the Alpha team still present in the city, and his death left her as the final target in the downtown district. The pilot's acceptance of his fate highlighted the hopelessness of the municipal situation. He was a veteran of the first disaster who had been reduced to a statistic in the second. The bar where they met became a localized tomb for the STARS legacy. Brad's transformation into a zombie, or his immediate death, served as the final confirmation that the organization was hunting its own. The pilot had been a witness to the corporate crimes, and his existence was a liability that the Nemesis was programmed to erase. The execution was a clean, tactical move that secured the organization's secrets. Brad Vickers was a hero of the Arklay incident, who died in the filth of a Raccoon City alleyway. The fire had claimed the pilot. Jill moved forward with a heightened sense of urgency following the death of her friend. She realized that the Nemesis would not stop until every name on the roster was crossed out. Brad's final warning was a legacy that she carried into the burning streets. He had provided her with the seconds she needed to survive, paying for that time with his own blood. The death of the pilot was the end of the unit's history. Jill was now truly alone against the monster. By the night of September 28th, the downtown district of Raccoon City had transformed into an absolute war zone. The RPD had lost total control of the urban center, as the volume of the infected overwhelmed every defensive perimeter. The unmanageable fires from the gas leaks and the structural collapses created a landscape of orange light and thick smoke. The city was no longer a place of human habitation. It was a biological incinerator where the remains of the social order were being purified by the flames. The streets were filled with the evidence of a failed evacuation. Abandoned vehicles, discarded emergency supplies, and piles of biological waste blocked the primary thoroughfares. The cannibal disease had reached its peak, with the necrotic swarms moving in coordinated patterns to consume the remaining healthy survivors. The infrastructure of the city was in a state of total collapse, with the power grid failing and the water system poisoned. Raccoon City was a closed loop of viral horror that was waiting for its final erasure. Jill navigated this environment with a clinical awareness of the danger. Every corner was a potential kill zone where the infected or the Nemesis could strike. The atmosphere was characterized by the sounds of distant explosions and the constant groaning of the undead. The city had become a laboratory where the organization monitored the performance of the T-virus in a dense population. The citizens were merely the raw material for a global experiment in biological warfare. The downtown was the furnace of the apocalypse. The structural decay of the city provided the Nemesis with a variety of tactical advantages. It could move through the ruins with a speed that the human survivors could not match. The organization utilized the urban chaos to hide the movements of its primary hunter, ensuring that Jill remained in a state of constant vulnerability. The streets were a maze of iron and fire that served the mission of the Predator. The beauty of the municipal architecture was hidden behind a mask of blood and ash. Ultimately, the streets of Raccoon City were the physical manifestation of the corporate arrogance. The pharmaceutical giant had built her empire on a foundation of genetic potential, and that empire was now burning. Jill realized that the only way to survive was to reach the evacuation point before the city was completely vaporized. The incinerator was running at full capacity, and the time for the survivors was running out. The city was a funeral pyre for the 1998 era, and the fire was spreading. Jill encountered Carlos Oliveira, a member of the UBCS Delta Platoon, in the early hours of the downtown exploration. Carlos was a former guerrilla fighter from South America who had been hired by Umbrella as expendable muscle for their biohazard response. He possessed a high level of combat experience and a casual detachment that initially clashed with Jill's professional urgency. Jill mistook him for a corporate hitman, leading to a relationship built on deep-seated distrust and tactical necessity. Carlos was a man who lived by the gun, now caught in an industrial nightmare. The background of the UBCS was a clinical record of the organization's exploitation. They recruited mercenaries and political exiles with the promise of a clean record, then deployed them into the most dangerous biological zones without adequate information. Carlos realized that his unit was being utilized as a disposable shield for the corporate secrets. Despite his mercenary status, he maintained a degree of human empathy that Jill found surprising. He was a survivor who was starting to realize that his employers were the real monsters of the night. Jill's distrust of Carlos was a logical response to her history with the pharmaceutical company. She saw the red and white logo on his uniform and identified him as an enemy of the STARS unit. However, the pressure of the Nemesis pursuit forced her to accept his assistance. Carlos provided the heavy firepower and the local knowledge needed to navigate the barricaded streets. Their partnership was a tactical alliance of convenience that was constantly tested by the biological horror. The mercenary was the only ally she had left in the incinerator. Carlos acted as a bridge between the corporate military and the civilian survivors. He was genuinely horrified by the scale of the outbreak, realizing that no amount of guerrilla training could prepare him for the walking dead. He worked to secure the transit routes for the remaining citizens, even as his own unit was being decimated by the virus. This moral streak was the primary reason Jill eventually allowed him into her tactical circle. Carlos was a man seeking a purpose in a city that was already dead. The introduction of the UBCS added a new layer of complexity to the urban war. They were a military force that was being sacrificed for the sake of experimental data. Carlos was the face of this betrayal, a soldier who was learning that his life had no value to the men in the suits. His relationship with Jill evolved from mutual suspicion to a shared mission for escape. The guerrilla fighter and the police officer were the two sides of the resistance against the Nemesis. The partnership was accidental victory for humanity. Part 8. Mikhail Victor, the captain of Delta Platoon. Mikhail Victor served as the captain of the UBCS Delta Platoon and was found by Jill in a state of severe physical trauma. Despite being an employee of the organization, Mikhail was a man of high honor and professional integrity. He was genuinely horrified by the biological disaster that had consumed the city and his men. Even while mortally wounded, his primary focus remained on the successful evacuation of the civilians trapped in the subway system. Mikhail was the moral anchor for the mercenary unit in the middle of the apocalypse. The captain's tactical composure was a visceral contrast to the chaos of the streets. He maintained a clear objective, even as the T-virus claimed the majority of his platoon. Mikhail realized that the mission they were given was an industrial lie, and he chose to prioritize the lives of the innocent over the corporate directives. He utilized the subway car as a temporary sanctuary for the refugees, coordinating the repairs and the security with a dying resolve. He was a leader who was prepared to die for a cause he no longer believed in. Jill recognized Mikhail's character immediately, seeing a professional soldier who shared her dedication to the protection of life. His presence in the subway provided the survivors with a sense of organized defense that was missing from the rest of the city. Mikhail acted as a mentor to Carlos, guiding the younger mercenary through the tactical reality of the urban collapse. He was the guardian of the transit plan, a man who held the keys to the only remaining exit. The captain was the soul of the resistance. The injuries Mikhail sustained were a clinical map of the violence on the streets. He had survived multiple encounters with the infected and the hunters, but his physical energy was reaching its biological limit. He refused to abandon his post, utilizing his authority to keep the survivors focused on the escape. Mikhail's honor was an unyielding force that even the Nemesis could not immediately break. He was a hero who happened to be wearing the wrong uniform. The subway was his final battlefield. Ultimately, Mikhail Victor represented the best of the professional military. He was a man who understood the weight of his duty and the cost of his loyalty. His struggle to save the civilians was a clinical rejection of the organization's nihilism. Jill's respect for the captain allowed her to trust the UBCS survivors enough to coordinate the Tram plan. Mikhail was the bridge between the corporate mercenaries and the police veteran. He was a flame of honor in a city of ash, and his time was running out. Part 9. Nikolai Zinoviev, the Cold Sergeant. Nikolai Zinoviev was a sergeant in the UBCS and a clinical contrast to the honor of Mikhail Victor. He was a cold and calculating operative who seemed entirely indifferent to the suffering of his men and the civilian population. Jill quickly sensed that Nikolai possessed a hidden agenda that was separate from the evacuation mission. He spent his time monitoring the biological data and checking his watch, rather than providing medical assistance to the wounded. Nikolai was a predator in the uniform of a soldier, a man who thrived in the atmosphere of corporate betrayal. His behavior was characterized by a total lack of human empathy and a professional focus on the acquisition of information. He moved through the city with a predatory speed, utilizing the chaos to fulfill his private mission for the organization. Jill observed his detachment with a growing suspicion, realizing that the sergeant was a dangerous variable in the subway plan. Nikolai was the face of the industrial spy, a man who viewed the outbreak as a financial opportunity. He was a ghost in the platoon who was waiting for his moment to strike. Nikolai's secret role was that of a supervisor, a specialized agent tasked with recording the combat data of the biological weapons. He was ordered to monitor the performance of the Nemesis and the T virus strains against the elite human targets. This mission required him to be an impartial observer of the massacre, ensuring that the organization received a complete record of the urban test. Nikolai utilized his tactical position to manipulate the survivors and the mercenaries, ensuring that the data remained pure. He was a clinical auditor of the apocalypse. The sergeant's interactions with Jill were a dance of deception and professional curiosity. He recognized her as a high-value asset and was interested in how she would perform against the Nemesis. He provided minimal information while gathering a maximum amount of intelligence on the STARS member. Nikolai was a man who understood the value of secrets in a global market. He was the shadow that followed the survivors, a human threat that was as lethal as the monsters in the dark. The city was his archive. Ultimately, Nikolai Zinoviev represented the absolute corruption of the corporate employee. He had traded his soul for a high-level security clearance and a corporate contract. His indifference to the death of his unit was a documented proof of his nihilism. Jill realized that Nikolai was an enemy who was hiding in plain sight, a man who was selling the city's end to the highest bidder. The sergeant was a reaper with a data pad, and he was the most dangerous man in the UBCS. The betrayal was already in motion. Part 10. Tyrell Patrick, the Watchdog. Tyrell Patrick served as the UBCS unit's hacker and surveillance expert, acting as the primary link between the squad and the municipal network. He was known as the Watchdog, a title that reflected his role in monitoring the local environment for corporate interests. Tyrell was a man who understood the depth of the organization's corruption, but tried to navigate the system from within to survive. He possessed a technical knowledge that made him an essential asset for the transit plan and the search for a vaccine. Tyrell was a professional who was caught between his duty and his conscience. His primary responsibility was the security of the laboratory data and the monitoring of the urban perimeter. Tyrell utilized his hacking skills to bypass the city's failed security systems, providing the survivors with the path to the subway and the hospitals. Unlike Nikolai, Tyrell maintained a sense of professional ethics that eventually led him to assist Jill and Carlos. He recognized that the organization had abandoned the city and that his only path to survival was through the cooperation of the survivors. The Watchdog was starting to bark at his own masters. Tyrell's interactions with the unit provided the tactical context for the night's events. He was the one who uncovered the evidence of the military's plan for the missile strike and the location of the secret laboratories. His technical expertise allowed the survivors to stay one step ahead of the corporate cleanup teams. Tyrell was a man of the screen who was forced to face the biological reality on the floor. He was a vital ally who provided the intelligence needed to challenge the organization's control over the incident. The psychological pressure on Tyrell was intense, as he was aware of the liquidation orders for his unit. He realized that the UBCS was being sacrificed to protect the corporate brand, and that his own skills were the only thing keeping him alive. This realization pushed him into an alliance with Jill, as he saw her as the only person capable of stopping the Nemesis. Tyrell was a specialist who was rewriting his own code to survive the apocalypse. He was the eyes and the ears of the resistance in the dark. Tyrell Patrick represented the human element within the technical machine. He was a man who utilized his skills for the sake of the living rather than the dead. His contribution to the evacuation plan was a clinical rejection of the organization's secrecy. Tyrell's journey through the 72 hours was a movement from a corporate asset to a human hero. He was the watchdog who chose to protect the truth, and his intelligence was the primary weapon of the final hours. The machine was in his hands. Part 11. Murphy's Seeker, the infected member, and the cold execution. Murphy Seeker was an infected UBCS member, discovered by the survivors in an abandoned downtown office. His physical state was a clinical example of the rapid T virus incubation within a healthy human host. Murphy was a skilled marksman who had been compromised during the initial street battles, and his presence provided a visceral record of the unit's mounting casualties. He represented the human vulnerability of the mercenary force, showing that even elite soldiers were susceptible to the microscopic threat. The office served as a localized hospital, where the hope for a medical recovery was reaching its end. Nikolai Zinoviev performed a cold execution of the soldier in a display of absolute pragmatism. He utilized his handgun to terminate Murphy before the viral transformation reached its final, aggressive stage. This act was committed with a total lack of hesitation or professional empathy, shocking Jill and Carlos with its clinical brutality. Nikolai ignored the possibility of a vaccine or a containment strategy, choosing instead to liquidate the asset immediately. The execution was a documented proof of the supervisor mindset, where the lives of the soldiers were considered secondary to the mission's speed. This event confirmed to Jill that the UBCS was not a rescue squad, but a corporate cleanup crew. The organization had deployed these men into a biological fire with the expectation that they would be consumed by it. Nikolai's actions revealed the true nature of the industrial contract, where the human element was a disposable resource. The execution of Murphy's Seeker was a message to the remaining survivors that the corporation had no loyalty to its own employees. The office was a crime scene where the law was replaced by a corporate protocol of erasure. The psychological impact of the execution created a permanent rift within the Delta platoon. Carlos realized that his superior officer was a man who viewed his subordinates as biological statistics. This moment of realization was essential for the eventual alliance between the mercenary and the police veteran. They understood that the organization had planned for their total liquidation from the beginning. Murphy's death was a clinical sign that the mission was failing. The silence following the gunshot was the sound of the unit's moral collapse. Biologically, G. Murphy's state provided Nikolai with the final data points on the early infection stages within a trained combatant. The sergeant was recording the physical symptoms and the mental decay of his own men to satisfy the corporate research requirements. Every kill was a successful observation in an urban laboratory. Murphy Seeker was a professional who was reduced to an industrial data point in a blood-stained room. The execution was the first step in Nikolai's plan to sanitize the squad of all witnesses. Ultimately, the death of Murphy Seeker was the moment the mask of the UBCS fell off. Jill recognized that she was moving through a city where the human predators were as dangerous as the reanimated dead. The cold logic of the sergeant was a reflection of the organization's absolute hubris. The survivors were now aware that their allies were working under a secondary, lethal agenda. The office was the graveyard of the unit's professional honor. The night was moving toward a total betrayal. Part 12, the Tram plan, the clock tower, evacuation, and the electrical grid. The Tram plan served as the only viable evacuation route remaining within the downtown district of Raccoon City. The survivors intended to utilize a heavy municipal subway train to reach the St. Michael's clock tower, which was designated as a primary extraction point for the remaining healthy population. This mechanical mission required the total coordination of Jill Valentine and the UBCS survivors. The Tram was an industrial hope in a city that had already officially died 48 hours prior. It was a metal bridge across an ocean of necrotic rot. Jill was tasked with navigating the municipal power substation to restore the electrical grid required for the transit. This environment was a high-risk zone filled with infected swarms and structural hazards. She had to manage the mechanical puzzles of the facility while being tracked by the Nemesis predator. The restoration of the power was a clinical test of her situational awareness and her technical resolve. The substation was a functional organ of the city that was being reclaimed by a biological fire. Jill was the spark that kept the escape mission alive. The subway tracks were blocked by wreckage and abandoned vehicles, requiring a series of environmental repairs. Jill had to locate the necessary components to clear the path, while avoiding the predatory strikes of the specialized hunter. Every delay increased the risk of the urban perimeter being completely vaporized by the military. The Tram plan was a race against a global clock. The survivors were moving through a labyrinth of iron and concrete, piecing together a mechanical solution to a biological problem. The transit was a tactical necessity for the final 72 hours. The Nemesis monitored the progress of the Tram plan with a mechanical focus. It understood that the subway was the primary path for its target and utilized its superior mobility to intercept Jill at key junctions. The Predator turned the industrial corridors into a private hunting ground, testing the effectiveness of its mission parameters. The organization recorded the data of these encounters, noting how Jill utilized the environment to bypass the super soldier. Just the Tram was the catalyst for some of the most intense combat of the night. The atmosphere within the subway tunnels was one of oppressive isolation. The survivors were trapped in a dark world of moisture and decay, moving toward a destination that offered no guarantee of safety. The Tram was a small sanctuary of light in a city that was preparing for its final erasure. Every mechanical success brought them closer to the surface, but it also brought them closer to the final confrontation. The plan was a documented proof of the human spirit's resilience in an industrial grave. Ultimately, the Tram plan was the definitive tactical objective of the second day. It provided the survivors with a shared goal that bridged the gap between the police veteran and the corporate mercenaries. The successful repair of the train was a victory for the human element over the biological chaos. However, the organization had already accounted for the transit, preparing the final obstacles for the survivors. The Tram was a vessel that carried the truth toward the clock tower. The journey was just beginning. Part 13, Nemesis with the rocket launcher, the high-grade ballistic upgrade. Nemesis revealed its ability to utilize heavy weaponry during the final transit to the station. The organization provided the creature with a high-grade rocket launcher designated for the total destruction of structural cover and armored targets. This ballistic upgrade proved that the NE Alpha parasite possessed a cognitive function capable of coordinating complex motor movements and aiming trajectories. The Predator was no longer just a physical threat. It was a professional marksman in an urban combat zone. The rocket launcher was the ultimate tool for the liquidation of the Star's survivors. The second major encounter with the armed Predator occurred near the downtown fuel tanker. The Nemesis utilized the rockets to flush Jill from her cover, turning the streets into a landscape of fire and debris. Jill was forced to utilize her tactical agility to dodge the explosive strikes while managing her limited resources. Every shot from the creature was a clinical demonstration of the power gap between the rookie and the biological god. The city was a live fire range where the human target was the primary focus. Carlos Oliveira was forced to act as a tactical distraction during this high-stakes engagement. He led the monster away from the subway entrance, buying Jill the seconds she needed to reach the tunnels. This sacrifice was a documented proof of the mercenaries' evolving loyalty to his new ally. Carlos utilized his guerrilla experience to evade the rockets, turning the alleyways into a temporary shield. The Predator followed the noise and the movement, allowing Jill to secure the transit route. The distraction was a successful tactical maneuver in a night of constant pressure. The use of the rocket launcher highlighted the absolute reach of the corporate resources. The organization was willing to unleash a heavy weapon in a civilian area to ensure the success of the cleanup operation. The rockets caused secondary explosions that accelerated the structural collapse of the downtown district. The Nemesis moved through the smoke with a mechanical persistence, ignoring the environmental hazards to maintain its mission. The creature was an unyielding force of industrial violence. The weapon was the extension of the corporate will. The encounter provided the survivors with a visceral understanding of the predator's evolution. They realized that the Nemesis was a being that could adapt to any tactical situation. The rocket launcher made the open streets a death zone, forcing the survivors into the cramped interiors of the buildings. Jill had to rethink her defensive strategy, utilizing the architecture to bypass the creature's line of sight. The super soldier was a reaper that possessed the tools of a modern army. The fight was a struggle for the survival of the species. Ultimately, the armed Nemesis represented the peak of the industrial super soldier project. It was a being that combined the power of the prehistoric fire with the logic of the ballistic age. Carlos's intervention was the only reason Jill survived the courtyard battle. The fuel tanker explosion provided a temporary reprieve, but the survivors knew that the predator would return. The rocket launcher was a sign that the organization was done playing with its toys. The night was reaching its clinical conclusion. Section 3, The Tram and the Clock Tower, Part 14, Boarding the Tram. The atmosphere of defeat and the industrial lie. Boarding the tram was an exercise in atmospheric defeat for the remaining survivors of the Delta platoon. The car was filled with terrified civilians who had sought sanctuary in the underground tunnels. She unaware that the city was already scheduled for erasure. The presence of the refugees provided a visceral record of the human cost of the T-virus. The interior of the train was a dark and cramped world of fear and medical decay. Every person on board was a witness to the total collapse of the municipal authority. The tram was a moving tomb for the innocent. Mikhail Victor realized during the transit that the entire rescue mission was an industrial lie. He understood that the UBCS had been deployed into the city to die as data points for the corporate research. The mercenaries were never meant to save the civilians or escape the urban perimeter. They were a disposable shield used to monitor the performance of the biological weapons in a real-world environment. This realization was a crushing blow to the captain's professional pride. He was a leader who had been betrayed by the very company he served. The atmosphere within the car was characterized by the sounds of the dying and the groans of the exhausted soldiers. The Delta platoon had been reduced to a handful of men who were struggling to maintain their tactical composure. The lack of supplies and the constant biological pressure had drained their physical energy. Jill observed the scene with a clinical awareness of the tragedy, seeing the human faces behind the corporate logo. The tram was the final refuge for a unit that had been decimated by its own masters. The Brotherhood was a memory of blood and iron. The civilians on board represented the variety of the Raccoon City population. Mothers, children, and the elderly sat in the shadows, waiting for a salvation that was not coming. Their presence added a layer of emotional weight to the mission, forcing Jill and Mikhail to prioritize their safety over their own survival. The tram was the physical manifestation of the survivors' hope, a mechanical vessel that carried the future of the species. However, the organization had already marked the train for liquidation. The innocent were the primary collateral of the night. Nikolai moved through the car with a cold detachment, monitoring the stress levels of the refugees and the physical state of the wounded. He viewed the scene as a clinical observation in an urban laboratory, recording the performance of the human element under extreme duress. The sergeant was a ghost in the platoon, a man who had already accepted the end of the mission. He was waiting for the moment to strike, she ensuring that the corporate data was secured at any cost. The tram was his final stage for the betrayal. Ultimately, boarding the tram was the moment the survivors accepted their isolation. They realized that there was no organized rescue and no help from the outside world. The tram was the only variable they could control in a city of chaos. Mikhail's honor was the only thing keeping the group unified, but his strength was reaching its biological limit. The transit was a movement toward the clock tower, a Gothic destination that held the promise of extraction. The journey was a documented struggle against the weight of the corporate empire. The nightmare was moving at high speed. Part 15, 2:11 a.m., September 29th. The standoff and the hunter's arrival. At 11 past 2 in the a.m. on September 29th, a tense standoff occurred within the moving car of the tram. Nikolai Zinoviev maintained a clinical skepticism regarding Jill's conspiracy theories about the organization's guilt. He utilized his professional authority to discredit the STARS member, claiming that the UBCS was a legitimate rescue force. This psychological pressure was a calculated move to maintain control over the survivors while he prepared his own escape. The air was thick with the scent of distrust and industrial oil. The conversation was a battle of information in the middle of a war. The dialogue was suddenly cut short when the Nemesis successfully boarded the rear car of the tram. The Predator's appearance was a visceral proof that Jill's warnings about a specialized hunter were technically accurate. The creature smashed through the reinforced doors as now utilizing its superior strength to breach the interior sanctuary. This event shifted the tactical focus from a psychological standoff to a primal struggle for space. The Nemesis had followed its target into the underground, proving that no environment was a shield against its mission. The Reaper was finally inside the train. The social tension was replaced by a high-stakes combat engagement within the metal tube. Jill and Mikhail were forced to engage the monster in a confined space where evasion was nearly impossible. The Predator utilized its physical power to crush the environmental cover, turning the car into a slaughterhouse. The survivors had to manage their limited resources while fighting an enemy that possessed an absolute reach. The Nemesis was a biological god that ignored the movement of the train. Every strike was a recorded success for the corporate mission. Nikolai utilized the chaos of the breach to prioritize his own mission over the safety of the unit. He monitored the engagement with a detached interest, recording the performance of the NA-alpha parasite in an interior environment. The sergeant saw the encounter as a unique opportunity to gather data on the STARS members' combat resilience. He had no intention of assisting his colleagues, viewing them as disposable variables in his professional audit. The standoff had evolved into a clinical trial for the industrial super soldier. The atmosphere of the train was one of absolute panic. The civilians in the rear car were the first to be targeted by the Predator, their screams echoing through the tunnels. Jill and Mikhail fought to maintain a defensive line, but the power gap was too large. The tram was a mechanical cage where the survivors were being processed by the machinery of the virus. The clock tower was approaching, but the interior of the train was already a graveyard. The arrival of the monster was the signal for the final act of the Delta platoon. Ultimately, the events of 2:11 a.m. were the turning point for the subway mission. The survivors realized that their harbor was compromised and that their allies were divided. The Nemesis had proven its unyielding persistence, tracking the target across the city and into the deep earth. Nikolai's betrayal was a cold reality that Jill could no longer ignore. The standoff was over, and the struggle for the train had begun. The nightmare was occurring at the speed of the transit. The city above was burning, and the fire was now inside the car. Section 3, The Tram and the Clock Tower. Part 16, Nemesis on the Train. The Slaughter and the locked door. The Nemesis initiated a systematic slaughter of the civilian population in the rear car of the tram. It moved with a mechanical precision, utilizing its superior strength and its biological tentacles to liquidate the refugees within seconds. This act was a clinical demonstration of the Predator's disregard for collateral damage. The organization had authorized the removal of all witnesses to ensure that the mission data remained secure. The interior of the train was painted with the blood of the innocent, turning the sanctuary into an industrial slaughterhouse. The screams of the dying were the soundtrack to the creature's success. Nikolai Zinoviev utilized this visceral distraction to initiate his own tactical retreat. He slipped away from the combat zone, while Jill and Mikhail were engaged with the monster, moving toward the front of the train to secure his own escape. In a final act of cold betrayal, Nikolai locked the reinforced door behind him, trapping his colleagues in a confined space with the biological god. This maneuver was a documented proof of the supervisor mission's priority over human life. Nikolai had officially chosen to protect the data at the cost of the unit. The locked door was the physical manifestation of the corporate nihilism. The isolation of Jill and Mikhail created a state of absolute tactical vulnerability. They were trapped in a metal tube with an enemy that possessed an infinite physical output. The Nemesis utilized the narrow corridors to corner its targets, ignoring the ballast and the movement of the train. Jill had to manage her limited ammunition while navigating the biological remains of the civilians. Every second was a measurement of her survival against her engineered Reaper. The train was a cage where the rules of the law were replaced by the logic of the hunt. The organization was recording every moment of the massacre. Biologically, the encounter on the train provided the researchers with data on the Nemesis's performance in a high-stress, interior environment. They noted how the NE-alpha parasite coordinated the host's aggression to maximize the lethality of its strikes. The creature was an agent of pure biological fire that could not be stopped by human weaponry. The locked door served as an environmental variable that tested the survivor's ability to think under pressure. Nikolai was the architect of this clinical trial, ensuring that the results were secured for the corporate archives. The train was a laboratory in motion. The slaughter on the tram was the most horrific moment of the night for Jill Valentine. She had spent the last 72 hours trying to save the city, only to watch the refugees be vaporized by the corporate monster. The locked door was a weight that added to her growing distrust of the industrial military. She realized that she was fighting a war on two fronts, one against the prehistoric fire and one against the human traitors. The Nemesis was the enforcer of the corporate will, and Nikolai was the manager. The train was moving toward a gothic end. Ultimately, the events on the tram confirmed the total failure of the rescue mission. The UBCS had been dismantled by its own sergeant, and the civilians had been liquidated by the corporate super soldier. Jill was left as the final witness to the massacre, trapped in an environment that was designed for her end. The locked door was a sign that the organization had already written the credits for the survivors. The tram was a vessel of blood and ash that was approaching the St. Michael's clock tower. The nightmare was reaching its final destination. Part 17, Mikhail Victor's Sacrifice, the C4 and the Captain's End. Mikhail Victor recognized that his physical energy was reaching its biological limit due to the extensive internal injuries he had sustained throughout the night. As the Nemesis breached the final defensive line within the car, the captain realized that a conventional victory was impossible. He chose to initiate a final act of tactical defiance to ensure the survival of Jill Valentine. Mikhail detonated a block of C4 explosives within the car, initiating a massive internal explosion that targeted the biological god. This sacrifice was a calculated move to blow the creature off the train and buy Jill the seconds she needed to reach the surface. The captain's end was a documented proof of his professional honor and his dedication to the protection of life. He chose to die as a soldier of the law, rather than a biological host for the organization's research. The explosion was a clinical rejection of the corporate nihilism, turning the Tram into a furnace that even the Nemesis could not withstand. Mikhail's final moments were spent looking into the eyes of the monster, his hand on the trigger of the industrial purge. He was the hero who had been betrayed by the red and white logo, and he had found his peace in the flames. The detonation caused a massive structural failure within the subway tunnels and derailed the tram cars. The physical trauma of the crash threw Jill from the wreckage, leaving her unconscious on the floor of the clock tower courtyard. Mikhail's sacrifice had successfully neutralized the immediate threat of the predator, but it had cost the unit its primary tactical authority. The captain's death was a visceral loss for the resistance, leaving Carlos as the only remaining member of the platoon. The fire had taken Mikhail, but it had left the door to the surface open for Jill. Biologically, the sacrifice provided a recorded proof of the T-virus's vulnerability to high-grade explosives in a confined space. The Nemesis suffered significant physical trauma from the blast, its limiter coat being compromised and its regenerative systems being temporarily overwhelmed. The organization noted the effectiveness of the C4 as a containment tool, recording the captain's final maneuver in their combat archives. Mikhail had provided the only successful countermeasure of the night. He was a human variable that the researchers had not accounted for in their mission parameters. The fire was his legacy. The derailment of the tram marked the end of the underground phase of the 72 hours. The survivors had reached the St. Michael's clock tower, but they had paid for the transit with the life of their leader. Jill was alone in a gothic graveyard, unaware of the captain's fate or the location of the monster. The sacrifice was a moment of absolute human clarity in a night of industrial madness. Mikhail Victor died as a winner of the moral war, leaving the corporate mercenaries in the ash. The train was a wreck, but the target was still breathing. Ultimately, the death of Mikhail Victor was the most significant law beat of the subway mission. It proved that the human spirit could match the raw power of the biological fire through an act of selfless loyalty. The captain had successfully sabotaged the organization's cleanup operation, ensuring that the witness remained alive to expose the truth. Mikhail's sacrifice was the light that Jill used to navigate the final hours of the city. He was the guardian of the transit, and his end was the signal for the final act of the clock tower. The Reaper had been pushed back by the man. Part 18. The crash into the clock tower. The narrative split. The crash of the tram into the St. Michael's clock tower courtyard was a catastrophic event that resulted in the total fragmentation of the remaining survivors. The physical trauma of the derailment left Jill Valentine in a state of absolute unconsciousness within the wreckage. The industrial violence of the crash was a visceral conclusion to the subway mission, leaving the environment in a state of burning ruin. Jill was isolated and vulnerable, her biological status reaching a critical low. The clock tower was a silent witness to the team's total tactical failure. The narrative was about to be split in two: Carlos Oliveira and Tyrell Patrick, having survived the initial impact, were forced to initiate a secondary mission while Jill recovered. They recognized that the city's communications were dead and that they needed to find a way to contact the outside world for extraction. The mercenaries headed toward the RPD station, believing that the police precinct might hold the necessary technology or a remaining officer. This decision divided the survivors at a moment of absolute need, leaving Jill alone in a Gothic tomb while the mercenaries navigated the ruins of the downtown district. The split was a clinical proof of the city's ability to dismantle any organized defense. The timeline of the police station entry was a documented record of the city's collapse. Carlos and Tyrell reached the precinct hours before the arrival of Leon and Claire, finding the building in a state of final structural and social failure. They encountered the first wave of zombies and the evidence of a total municipal failure. This parallel journey provided the tactical context for the station's fall, showing that the law had been erased long before the rookie arrived. The mercenaries were moving through a cemetery of marble and steel, searching for a ghost in the machine. The narrative was a mirror of the mansion's isolation. Jill's solitary position in the courtyard was a high-risk situation that the organization monitored with a clinical interest. They saw that their primary target was incapacitated and that the super soldier was temporarily neutralized by the explosion. This pause in the engagement was a unique window for the researchers to assess the physical resilience of the human host. The courtyard was a biological laboratory where Jill was the only subject. The Gothic architecture of the tower provided a grotesque contrast with the industrial fire of the train. The survivor was a pawn in a game of global espionage. The narrative split allowed for a broader understanding of the Raccoon City disaster. Carlos witnessed the aftermath of the station's fall, while Jill navigated the puzzles of the clock tower. These two separate stories were the twin pillars of the 72 hours, showing how the different survivors adapted to the prehistoric fire. The mercenaries were fighting for a way out, while the police veteran was fighting for her life. The city was a maze that forced the team to separate to find the truth. The crash was the catalyst for the final evolution of the survivors. Ultimately, the events following the crash were the preamble to the final act of the city's destruction. The team was divided and exhausted, their resources reaching a terminal low. Carlos's mission to the station was a desperate attempt to find a miracle in a graveyard. Jill's isolation in the tower was a documented test of her will to survive. The narrative split was a sign that the organization had successfully dismantled the human resistance. The clock tower was the stage for the final judgment. The Reaper was already moving through the shadows. Jill Valentine woke up inside the Gothic halls of the St. Michael's clock tower, finding herself entirely alone in an environment of oppressive silence. This building was originally intended as a neutral meeting ground for international diplomacy, a fact that added a layer of historical irony to its current status. The interior was decorated with religious art and complex mechanical clocks, representing the peak of the municipal culture. However, the tower had been transformed into a biological tomb by the spread of the T virus. The halls were filled with the remains of the staff and the refugees who had sought a sanctuary that did not exist. Jill was forced to navigate the labyrinth of traps and puzzles without any tactical support from her teammates. The mechanical logic of the tower mirrored the architectural philosophy of the Spencer Mansion, requiring a high level of cognitive resolve to bypass the security. Every door and every clock was a mechanical filter that tested Jill's ability to think under pressure. She moved through the rooms with a clinical awareness of the danger, piecing together the final hours of the tower's fall. The Gothic architecture was a beautiful mask for the industrial decay of the city. Jill was the only living thing in a world of marble ghosts. The lack of support increased the psychological pressure on the police veteran. She had lost her weapon, her teammate, and her sanctuary in a single night. The tower was a silent witness to her isolation, its bells and gears moving with a cold indifference to the apocalypse. Jill found the diaries of the people who had hidden in the tower, documenting their slow descent into viral hunger. The tower was an archive of human fear, showing that the prehistoric fire had no respect for the sacred or the diplomatic. The halls were a cemetery of high character and failed hopes. The survivor was walking through the end of the world. The puzzles of the clock tower were a documented test of the host's sensory and motor coordination. Jill had to locate the necessary gears and keys to reach the upper levels, utilizing the environment to stay ahead of the infected swarms. The organization monitored her progress through the tower's internal security system, recording how she adapted to the Gothic traps. They saw that the STARS member possessed a situational awareness that surpassed their research data. The tower was a laboratory where the history of the species was being rewritten in blood. Jill was the primary variable in the clinical trial of the tower. The isolation provided Jill with a moment of absolute clarity regarding the corporate betrayal. She saw that the organization had utilized the city's cultural landmarks as sites for their biological research. The tower was no longer a place of international peace. It was a node in a global network of bioterrorism. The mechanical clocks were the only thing that remained stable in a city of chaos. Jill realized that her only path to survival was through the triggering of the signal. The tower was the gateway to the final escape, but it was also the cage where the Reaper was waiting. Ultimately, the solitary journey through the clock tower was the definitive test of Jill Valentine's character. She had faced the biological god and the human traitor, and she was still standing. Just the Gothic tomb was the final stage for her survival before the arrival of the helicopter. The puzzles were the mechanical bridge to her escape. Jill was a professional who utilized her skills to overcome the weight of the corporate empire. The tower was a monument to her resilience, a place where the police veteran proved her worth against the prehistoric fire. The bells were waiting to be rung. Part 20. Ringing the Bell. The 30 seconds of hope and the helicopter signal. Jill Valentine successfully reached the upper levels of the tower and triggered the massive bells, initiating a visceral signal for the rescue helicopter. The sound of the bells was a powerful acoustic wave that resonated across the downtown district, reaching the ears of the remaining survivors. This act was a documented victory for the human element, proving that the signal for salvation could still be rung in a city of ash. For 30 seconds, as the rescue aircraft descended through the smoke and the fire, it appeared that the 72 hours of horror were finally over. The bells were the heartbeat of the resistance. The atmosphere in the courtyard was one of absolute physical and psychological relief. Jill stood on the balcony, watching the harbor of safety approach her position. The arrival of the helicopter was the first sign of outside intervention in a night of total isolation. The survivors believed that the military or the federal government had finally breached the corporate perimeter to save the witnesses. The 30 seconds of hope were a clinical pause in the biological war, a moment of visceral clarity in a city of madness. The escape felt like a documented certainty. The helicopter represented the transition from the biological cage to the freedom of the outside world. It was a mechanical vessel that carried the promise of a future for the survivors. Jill prepared for the extraction, her focus on the aircraft's landing sequence. The sound of the engines was a clinical contrast to the groans of the undead in the streets below. The survivors were on the threshold of the end, moving toward a world that still possessed the law. The bells were the final word of the clock tower mission. The night was breaking into the morning light. However, the organization had already accounted for the extraction attempt. They understood that the arrival of outside aircraft was a threat to their total cleanup operation. The Nemesis was programmed to intercept any rescue force that attempted to enter the target zone. The 30 seconds of hope were a clinical illusion that allowed the super soldier to position itself for the final strike. The bells had alerted the predator to Jill's location, turning the signal for life into a signal for death. The Reaper was already aiming its rocket at the harbor of safety. The hope was a psychological byproduct of the survivors' desperation. They wanted to believe that the fire could be put out by a helicopter and a bell. Jill realized too late that the city was a closed ecosystem where the organization controlled the exits. The rescue aircraft was a target for the industrial super soldier, a vulnerable machine in a sky filled with smoke. The bells were a signal that the final act of the clock tower was beginning. The 30 seconds were a weight that the survivors would carry for the rest of their lives. Ultimately, ringing the bell was the most tragic law beat of the night. It proved that the human spirit could reach out for help, only to be struck down by the corporate hand. The helicopter was the final gift of the old world, and it was about to be reduced to ash. Jill's victory was a documented failure in the face of the biological god. The 30 seconds of hope were a cruel preamble to the final confrontation in the courtyard. The bells were a signal that the time for the city was over. The nightmare was reaching its high-stakes conclusion. Part 21. Nemesis destroys the helicopter. The vaporized hope. The rescue helicopter was vaporized in mid-air by a high-grade rocket fired from the courtyard floor. This clinical strike was executed by the Nemesis Predator, which had reappeared to terminate the extraction attempt. The hope of the survivors died instantly as the burning wreckage fell into the Gothic architecture of the tower. This event was a documented proof of the organization's total control over the urban airspace. The helicopter was the industrial harbor that was reduced to a pillar of fire within seconds. The survivors were once again isolated in a city of ash. The destruction of the aircraft served as a tactical signal for the final phase of the clock tower engagement. The organization had authorized the removal of any outside intervention to ensure the target remained within the urban laboratory. The Nemesis moved through the smoke of the crash with a mechanical focus, ignoring the environmental hazards to reach Jill. The wreckage blocked the primary exits, turning the courtyard into a restricted kill zone. The fire from the fuel tanks illuminated the biological aggression of the super soldier. The dream of escape was an industrial ruin. Jill Valentine was forced into an immediate and brutal struggle while the debris was still falling from the sky. She realized that the organization would never allow a healthy witness to leave the city. The helicopter was a sacrificial lamb used to draw the target into the open. The Nemesis utilized its physical power to smash through the stone pillars, closing the distance with a supernatural speed. The battle was a visceral demonstration of the power gap between a human and a biological god. The courtyard was an altar for the corporate ambition. The psychological impact of the crash was a clinical factor in Jill's performance. She had witnessed the death of her only salvation, and her tactical focus was compromised by the sudden trauma. The Nemesis utilized this window to launch a series of aggressive strikes, testing the resilience of the STARS member. The organization recorded the data of this encounter, noting how the target adapted to the loss of the rescue mission. The clock tower was a cemetery of hope where the bells had brought only death. The fire was spreading. The ballistic accuracy of the super soldier proved that the NE alpha parasite possessed the advanced coordination of the host's motor functions. The rocket had struck the target at a high altitude, showing the creature's ability to track fast-moving objects. The Nemesis was a professional marksman that operated with a total lack of human error. The organization was pleased with the result, as the destruction of the helicopter maintained the secrecy of the cleanup operation. The city was a closed loop of engineered horror. The Reaper was in the courtyard. Ultimately, the destruction of the helicopter was the final word on the Raccoon City isolation. The world outside was aware of the signal, but they could not reach the survivors through the corporate fire. Jill was trapped in a gothic grave, with a monster that possessed an infinite arsenal. The wreckage was a reminder that the organization owned the sky and the ground. The fight in the courtyard was the climax of the 72 hours, a struggle for the survival of the species. The hope was gone, and only the fire remained. Part 22. The T-virus injection, the viral coma, and the mutation. During the final moments of the courtyard engagement, the Nemesis utilized a specialized biological spike to pierce Jill Valentine's shoulder. This was a deliberate tactical strike that resulted in the direct injection of a concentrated T-virus strain into her nervous system. The Predator was no longer attempting to liquidate the target through raw physical trauma. It was initiating a viral conversion to test the host's genetic resilience. The injection was a documented success for the NE alpha parasite's secondary mission parameters. Jill's body was now a laboratory for the prehistoric fire. The immediate reaction to the pathogen caused Jill to suffer a total neurological collapse. She fell from the balcony into the courtyard, her consciousness fading as the virus began to rewrite her DNA. This event was a clinical turning point for the investigation, as the primary witness was now a victim of the very plague she sought to expose. The Nemesis observed the collapse with a detached interest, its mission partially fulfilled by the infection of the STARS member. The super soldier then retreated into the shadows to begin its own secondary mutation. The courtyard was a tomb for the police veteran. The infection of Jill Valentine provided the organization with a unique opportunity to study the interaction between the T-virus and the elite human host. They monitored her vital signs through the internal sensors of the tower, recording the speed of the viral expansion. The pathogen fought for dominance over her immune system, causing a state of deep viral coma. This period of unconsciousness was a clinical bridge between the second and third days of the city's destruction. Jill was a carrier of the apocalypse, her mind trapped in a fever dream of the mansion. The biological trauma of the spike caused the immediate inflammation of the surrounding tissue, serving as the entry point for the viral load. Jill's physical energy was reaching a terminal low as her body redirected all resources to fight the infection. The clock tower became a clinical ward where the survivor was fighting an invisible war for her soul. The Nemesis had left a piece of its own horror within her blood. The mutation was a slow fire that was burning through her tactical training. The survivor was a pawn in a genetic game of chess. The coma protected Jill from the immediate chaos of the city's final collapse, but it also left her vulnerable to the secondary predators. She lay in the courtyard while the fires burned around her, a silent witness to the end of the 1998 era. The organization realized that if Jill survived the infection, she would possess a biological record of the Nemesis project. This made her survival a high-stakes variable for the corporate archives. The vaccine was now the only objective that mattered for the remaining survivors. The night was closing in on the comatose officer. Ultimately, the T-virus injection was the most dangerous moment of Jill Valentine's career. She had bypassed the zombies and the rockets, but she could not outrun the microscopic Reaper. The injection was a clinical proof of the organization's absolute reach. The clock tower was a gothic grave where the survivor was waiting for a cure or a mutation. The Nemesis had successfully compromised the human element, leaving the city to burn. The 72 hours were approaching the final act. The fire was in her blood. Section 4, Carlos Alone, September the 29th. Part 23, Carlos and Tyrell at the RPD, the Fallen Precinct. Carlos Oliveira reached the Raccoon City Police Department on the morning of September 29th, hours before the arrival of the civilian survivors. He was accompanied by Tyrell Patrick, the unit's technical expert, who sought to utilize the precinct's communications network to contact the corporate handlers. They found the building in a state of final structural and social failure. The main hall was filled with the first wave of the necrotic swarms and the remains of the police barricades. The station was a cemetery of marble that offered no tactical relief for the mercenaries. The investigation of the RPD provided Carlos with a visceral record of the city's failed defense. He observed the blood-stained corridors and the abandoned tactical gear, realizing that the law had been erased long before he arrived. Tyrell focused on the computer terminals in the STARS office, she attempting to bypass the corporate firewalls to find the location of the vaccine. The mercenaries were moving through a world of ghosts, piecing together the final hours of the municipal authority. The precinct was a cold and silent witness to the corporate betrayal. The presence of the mercenaries in the station was a documented anomaly in the organization's cleanup plan. They were moving through a zone that had already been designated for liquidation. Carlos utilized his guerrilla experience to clear the hallways of the remaining infected, discovering that the zombies were only the first layer of the biological horror. The station was a labyrinth of traps and puzzles that had been designed to slow the police response. The mercenaries were the final intruders in a building that had been reclaimed by the virus. Carlos witnessed the physical evidence of the STARS members' struggle to expose the truth. He found the diaries and the logs that documented the corporate cover-up following the mansion incident. This information reinforced his distrust of the pharmaceutical giant, making him an intentional ally of the police veteran. He realized that the organization had sacrificed the precinct to protect its research data. The RPD was the industrial shield that had finally shattered under the weight of the prehistoric fire. The mercenary was the only one left to read the records. Tyrell successfully accessed the municipal servers, discovering the coordinates for the secret laboratories hidden beneath the city. He also identified the presence of a high-level corporate assassin moving through the district. This intelligence was a clinical warning that the survivors were being hunted by their own employers. The mercenaries realized that the station was no longer a sanctuary and that they needed to find a way to the hospital. The RPD was an archive of failure that they were eager to leave behind. The mission was moving toward the cure. Ultimately, the visit to the police station was the catalyst for Carlos's evolution from a mercenary to a hero. He saw the remains of the men who had fought for the law and chose to honor their memory by saving Jill. The station provided the necessary intelligence for the final act of the 72 hours. Carlos and Tyrell departed the precinct as the fires began to consume the roof. They were the only ones who knew the truth of the station's fall. The graveyard was behind them, and the hospital was ahead. Part 24. Marvin Branner's final hours. The last witness. During his investigation of the main hall, Carlos Oliveira witnessed the final hours of Lieutenant Marvin Branner. The officer was found in a state of terminal exhaustion, struggling to maintain a defensive line against the necrotic swarms. Marvin had sustained a lethal bite during the initial evacuation and was in the early stages of a viral transformation. His presence in the hall was a documented proof of the human spirit's resilience in the face of absolute biological horror. He was a professional who chose to die at his post rather than abandon the survivors. Carlos observed the officer's struggle with a clinical empathy, recognizing the high character of the RPD leadership. Marvin refused to accept medical help, realizing that his own journey was reaching its biological conclusion. He maintained his tactical composure, providing Carlos with the directions to the secondary exits. The lieutenant was a man who understood the weight of his duty, even as the virus began to rewrite his nervous system. He was the last representative of the law in a city of madness. The encounter was a visceral reminder of the price of the prehistoric fire. The scene reinforced the powerlessness of even good men against the corporate plague. Marvin possessed the tactical training and the weapons of the elite officer, but he was vulnerable to the microscopic Reaper. Carlos realized that the organization had traded the lives of men like Marvin for the sake of a biological commodity. The lieutenant's suffering was a clinical byproduct of the corporate ambition. The hall was an altar where the municipal honor was being sacrificed. The mercenary moved forward with a heavier heart and a more focused mission. Marvin's eventually turn into a zombie was the final act of the precinct's fall. Carlos watched as the officer's humanity was erased by the T-virus, leaving only a mindless consumer in a uniform. This transformation was a documented tragedy that marked the end of the legal authority in Raccoon City. The lieutenant had held the line until the fire took his mind. He was a hero who had been reduced to a biological statistic by the corporate negligence. The station was now a graveyard where the only living things were the monsters. The interaction between the mercenary and the officer was a moment of tactical synchronization. Marvin provided the path, and Carlos provided the muscle. They were two professional soldiers from different worlds, brought together by a shared nightmare. Marvin's final command to save the living was a legacy that Carlos carried into the hospital. The lieutenant had fulfilled his duty, leaving the mercenary to finish the war. The main hall was silent once again, and the fire was spreading. Ultimately, the presence of Marvin Branner was the emotional core of the police station investigation. He proved that the human element was the only thing that remained stable in a world of viral rot. Carlos's witness to the officer's end was a clinical proof of the organization's guilt. The pharmaceutical giant had destroyed the men who protected the city. The lieutenant's death was a signal for the final escape. Carlos departed the hall, leaving the last witness to the prehistoric fire in the dark. Part 25. Dr. Nathaniel Bard. The Defector and the Vaccine. Dr. Nathaniel Bard was a high-level umbrella scientist who had defected from the organization following the realization of the T-virus project's lethality. Bard possessed the specialized knowledge required to synthesize a vaccine for the local strains, making him a primary target for the corporate cleanup operation. He had barricaded himself within the Spencer Memorial Hospital, utilizing the facility's research terminals to finalize the cure. Bard was a man of high intelligence who was being hunted by his own employers for the crime of possessing a conscience. The scientist was the key to Jill Valentine's survival. Umbrella's assassins, led by the Sergeant Nikolai Zinoviev, were deployed with a focused mission to eliminate Bard and destroy his research. The organization understood that a viable vaccine was a threat to their total cleanup operation. They wanted to ensure that no record of the viral treatment survived the city's destruction. Bard was a loose variable who held the future of the species in his hand. The hospital was an active combat zone where the scientist was the primary prize. Carlos realized that reaching Bard was the only way to save Jill from the infection. The background of Nathaniel Bard was a clinical record of the corporate arrogance. He had been a willing participant in the biological research until the scale of the Raccoon City outbreak forced him to reassess his loyalty. He understood that the organization was building a Reaper and that he was the one who had provided the scythe. His creation of the vaccine was a final act of professional atonement. He, Bard, was a man seeking a miracle in a city of ash. He was the architect of the cure, and his time was running out. Carlos tracked the scientist through the hospital's internal servers, discovering that the organization had already breached the perimeter. The facility was filled with the infected staff and the biological weapons known as hunter beta models. These creatures were specifically deployed to sanitize the building of all human witnesses. Bard's location was a high-security lab that was being besieged by the corporate mercenaries. The search for the scientist was a high-stakes sprint through a biological nursery. The cure was a purple liquid that was hidden behind a wall of blood. The discovery of Bard's laboratory revealed the depth of the corporate influence within the medical community. The hospital was being utilized as a secret testing ground for the viral treatments, with the patients acting as accidental subjects. Bard's logs documented the clinical failure of the initial trials and the success of the final vaccine synthesis. He had successfully bypassed the T-virus parameters to create a stable countermeasure. The scientist was a professional hero who had finished his mission under a death sentence. The files were the evidence of his victory. Ultimately, Dr. Nathaniel Bard represented the potential for human redemption within the corporate machine. He was a man who utilized his skills for the sake of the living rather than the dead. His vaccine was the only weapon capable of stopping the prehistoric fire in Jill's blood. Carlos's mission to find him was a documented struggle against the weight of the corporate empire. The scientist's life was a clinical price for the truth. The hospital was a tomb for the defector, but it was also the birthplace of the cure. The search was reaching its climax. Part 26, 9:20 p.m. The hospital gauntlet. At 9:20 p.m. on September 29th, Carlos Oliveira reached the Spencer Memorial Hospital to initiate the retrieval of the vaccine. The building was a clinical environment that had been claimed by the necrotic rot and the specialized predators of the organization. Carlos was forced to fight through the infected floors with a tactical focus, managing his limited ammunition against the hunter beta models. These creatures moved with a supernatural speed and utilized their massive claws to decapitate the human targets. The hospital was a gauntlet of engineered death. The navigation of the facility required a high level of situational awareness, as the building was a labyrinth of locked wards and sterile labs. Carlos utilized his heavy weaponry to bypass the biological barriers, moving floor by floor toward the scientist's location. The atmosphere was characterized by the sounds of the dying and the clinical hum of the failing life support systems. Every room was a visceral record of the outbreak spread through the medical staff. The hospital was a nursery for the virus, and the mercenary was the primary intruder. The hunter beta models represented a documented upgrade to the original Arclay research. They possessed a thick hide that could resist small arms fire and the unyielding aggression that tested the mercenaries' resolve. Carlos realized that the organization had deployed these assets to ensure that no one left the hospital alive. The creatures utilized the narrow corridors to flank and ambush the targets, turning the facility into a private hunting ground. The gauntlet was a clinical proof of the super soldier's effectiveness. The fire was in the halls. During the climb, Carlos discovered the evidence of the organization's illegal experimentation on the local population. The hospital was a facade for a biological weapons factory, where the patients were utilized as raw material for the viral research. This discovery hardened his resolve to find the vaccine and expose the truth to the world. He moved with a desperate speed, realizing that the self-destruct sequence for the city was approaching. The 9:20 p.m. arrival was the start of a final tactical engagement for the cure. The technical infrastructure of the hospital was failing, with the power flickering and the emergency sirens silent. Carlos had to solve the mechanical puzzles of the lab access codes while fighting off the predators. He was a man of the gun who was forced to become an investigator of the corporate secrets. Every floor cleared was a measurement of his survival against the corporate machine. The hospital was a graveyard of high character and failed hopes. The mercenary was the only one left to reach the top. Ultimately, the hospital gauntlet was the definitive test of Carlos Oliveira's physical and mental endurance. He had faced the zombies and the hunters, and he was still moving toward the scientist. The gauntlet was a clinical proof of the organization's absolute hubris. The cure was a purple liquid that was hidden behind a wall of engineered death. Carlos was a professional who utilized his skills to overcome the weight of the corporate empire. The hospital was a altar where the mercenary proved his worth against the prehistoric fire. The vaccine was within reach. Part 27. Nikolai and the C4. The hospital betrayal. Carlos Oliveira successfully located Dr. Nathaniel Bard's laboratory, only to find the scientist already dead. Bard had been murdered by Nikolai Zinoviev, who had infiltrated the facility to sanitize the research and the witness. The sergeant had utilized a single clinical shot to eliminate the defector before he could hand over the vaccine. This act was a documented proof of Nikolai's commitment to his private mission as a supervisor. He was a man who viewed the cure as a liability and the scientist as an industrial data point. The laboratory was a scene of a cold corporate execution. To hide the evidence of his crime and the existence of the vaccine research, Nikolai planted C4 explosives throughout the hospital. He intended to vaporize the facility and everyone inside to ensure that the organization's secrets remained buried. This betrayal was a visceral demonstration of the sergeant's Nihil SM. He had no loyalty to his unit or the human race, viewing the urban apocalypse as a financial opportunity. The timer on the explosives was a clinical countdown for Carlos's life. The mercenary was trapped in a building that was about to become an incinerator. Nikolai monitored Carlos's reaction through the security cameras, recording the tactical response of the mercenary under extreme pressure. He saw the betrayal as a unique data point for his report, noting how Carlos prioritized the retrieval of the sample over his own safety. The sergeant was a reaper who utilized the environment to test the human element. The C4 was the industrial tool used to erase the human failure. Nikolai's departure from the hospital was a clean tactical move that left the survivors in the ash. The betrayal was total. The presence of the explosives forced Carlos to move with a supernatural speed through the remaining floors. He had to navigate the biological threats and the mechanical locks while the clock was ticking. The hospital was no longer a ward of healing. It was a bomb that was waiting to explode. Carlos utilized his technical knowledge to bypass the security, reaching the final storage unit for the vaccine. The betrayal had turned the mission into a frantic struggle for time. The fire was already in the wires. The relationship between the sergeant and the mercenary was officially terminated by the sound of the timer. Carlos realized that Nikolai was the true face of the organization, a predator that wore a uniform to hide its mission. The betrayal shattered any remaining belief in the corporate rescue mission. The mercenaries were being liquidated by their own leader to protect the stock value. Carlos was a man alone in a world of industrial fire, fighting for a miracle that the organization wanted to burn. The laboratory was a cage. Ultimately, the betrayal inside the hospital was the most significant law beat of Carlos's night. It proved that the human threat was as lethal as the biological god. Nikolai's cold logic was a reflection of the organization's absolute greed. The C4 was a signal that the time for the city was over. Carlos's escape with the vaccine was a documented victory for the human element over the corporate machine. The hospital was vaporized, but the cure was secure. The mercenary had outrun the Reaper. Part 28. The vaccine. Retrieved, the escape, and the cure. Carlos Oliveira successfully secured a sample of the devil vaccine and escaped the hospital just as the C4 explosives leveled the building. The industrial violence of the explosion vaporized the remaining evidence of Dr. Bard's research and the corporate crimes within the wards. Carlos emerged from the smoke with the purple liquid in his hand, representing the only successful countermeasure of the night. He had matched the speed of the betrayal with the speed of his own survival. The vaccine was a documented victory for the human spirit over the prehistoric fire. The retrieval of the cure was a clinical turning point for the investigation. Carlos realized that he possessed the only tool capable of stopping the viral expansion in Jill's blood. He initiated a high-speed transit back to the St. Michael's clock tower, navigating the burning streets and the necrotic swarms with a desperate focus. The vaccine was a heavy weight that contained the future of the police veteran. The mercenary was a professional who was carrying the hope of the species through a graveyard. The city was a biological incinerator. But the fire was being challenged by the cure. Carlos reached the clock tower courtyard and administered the vaccine to the comatose Jill Valentine. This act was a visceral demonstration of his loyalty to his new ally. He utilized the laboratory protocols to ensure the injection was successful, initiating an immediate chemical war within Jill's nervous system. The vaccine began to neutralize the T-virus parameters, triggering a slow recovery for the host. Carlos had successfully bypassed the mutation clock, saving Jill from a final stage conversion. The student had been rescued by the mercenary. The physical recovery of Jill was a documented miracle of medical science. The devil agent was a stable and effective platform that rewrote the host's DNA to resist the viral intrusion. Carlos monitored her condition through the final hours of the night, recording the stabilization of her vital signs. He had fulfilled his mission to find the defector and the cure, providing the survivors with a final chance for escape. The courtyard was a Gothic sanctuary where the fire was being pushed back. The mercenary was the guardian of the recovery. The retrieval of the vaccine also provided the survivors with a powerful leverage against the corporate handlers. They possessed the only physical proof of the organization's guilt and the only weapon against the plague. This knowledge changed the stakes of the final 72 hours. They were no longer just survivors. They were the architects of the corporate downfall. Carlos's success was a clinical failure for the organization's cleanup operation. The Reaper had been defeated by the purple liquid. The night was moving toward the sunrise. Ultimately, The retrieval of the vaccine was the most important law beat of Carlos's night. It proved that the corporate science could be used to protect life rather than destroy it. The escape from the hospital was a documented victory for the human element. Carlos had proved his worth as a tactical officer and a moral actor. The cure was a signal that the nightmare was not absolute. The mercenary had found the light in the dark, and he was ready to finish the war. The city was still burning, but Jill was awake. Section 5, 3 Days Unconscious, Part 29, The Final Hours, The Dying Population and the Sterilization Operation. From September 29th to October 1st, the population of Raccoon City was effectively reduced to 0 human survivors. The necrotic swarms had claimed every street and every building, turning the urban center into absolute biological graveyard. The social infrastructure was gone, with the fires and the structural collapses reaching a terminal state. The city was a closed ecosystem of prehistoric fire, waiting for its final industrial erasure. The organization monitored the scene with a clinical detachment, recording the total success of the urban test. The end was a documented certainty. The United States government, realizing that the containment was impossible, authorized the initiation of the sterilization operation. This was a clinical plan for the total destruction of the city via a nuclear or thermobaric strike. The military moved to the perimeter, establishing a no-fly zone, an absolute blockade of the mountain range. They wanted to ensure that no viral load could escape the target zone, even at the cost of the remaining witnesses. The city was officially designated for liquidation by the federal authority. The fire was about to be met with a greater fire. The atmospheric conditions of the city during these 3 days were characterized by a oppressive silence and a high concentration of viral spores. The environment was no longer habitable for a standard human organism. The T virus had reached its peak, with the predators like the hunters and the lickers dominating the streets. Raccoon City was an industrial relic that was being reclaimed by a distorted version of nature. The organization utilized this window to finalize their data collection before the missile strike. The graveyard was being audited. The government's decision was a visceral response to the global threat of the T virus. They understood that the corporate negligence had created a monster that could not be contained by conventional means. The sterilization was a necessary act of national security, a clinical erasure of the American city to save the world. The survivors were now trapped in a target zone where the Reaper was falling from the sky. The 24-hour warning was the final notice for the people in the shadows. The city was a memory of blood and iron. Jill Valentine remained unconscious during the height of this operation, her body a battlefield for the vaccine and the virus. She was unaware that the world outside had already written the credits for her city. The clock tower was a Gothic sanctuary that was located at the center of the impact zone. Every hour that passed brought her closer to the final fire. The organization monitored her recovery, noting the resilience of the host. They saw that the witness was still breathing in a city that was already dead. The countdown was a digital heartbeat. Ultimately, the final hours were the closing chapter of the Raccoon City history. The city had been sacrificed for the sake of a biological arms race, and the government was now burning the laboratory. The sterilization operation was the final cleanup for the 1998 era. The survivors were the only loose variables in a clinical plan of erasure. The city was a funeral pyre that was waiting for the spark. The sunrise of October 1st was the signal for the end. The fire was coming for everyone. Part 30. The emergency broadcast. The 24-hour warning. An emergency broadcast was initiated on the morning of September 30th, delivering an absolute 24-hour warning to the surrounding areas and the remaining survivors. The message was a clinical announcement from the federal government, stating that Raccoon City would be destroyed by a tactical missile strike at dawn on October 1st. The broadcast was a documented sign that the time for rescue was over and the time for erasure had begun. The military confirmed the perimeter and the no-fly zone, leaving the people inside with zero hope for external intervention. The warning was the sound of the world moving on. The broadcast reached the few remaining radios and televisions in the city, providing a psychological pressure that tested the resolve of the survivors. It was a visceral reminder that they were trapped in a target zone where the only objective was survival. The 24-hour clock was a mechanical reaper that was approaching its final strike. The survivors realized that they needed to find a way to escape the perimeter before the missile vaporized the evidence of the corporate crimes. The warning was a catalyst for the final sprint toward the helipad. The city was a tomb with a timer. The decision to destroy the city was a clinical necessity that ignored the human cost of the remaining survivors. The government prioritized the containment of the virus over the lives of the witnesses. This act was a sign of the total failure of the social contract. The survivors were being liquidated by their own government to protect the species from the corporate rot. The broadcast was a message that the law was no longer enough to stop the prehistoric fire. The only thing that mattered was the total destruction of the biological fire. The warning was the end of the line. Tyrell Patrick monitored the broadcast through the laboratory terminals, recording the coordinates of the coming strike. He realized that the team had only hours to find the remaining vaccine samples and escape the impact zone. The technical expert utilized his skills to coordinate the final path, moving with a desperate focus to beat the clock. The warning had changed the stakes of the mission from an investigation to a sprint. The city was an industrial relic that was about to be reduced to ash. Every second was a measurement of their survival. The atmosphere of the city following the broadcast was one of absolute dread. The fires and the monsters remained, but they were now secondary to the threat from the sky. The survivors were moving through a world that was already scheduled for destruction. The 24-hour warning was a clinical signal that the organization had successfully manipulated the political leadership into an absolute cover-up. The witnesses were being burned with the lab. The warning was the final word of the 1998 incident. The sunrise was the reaper. Ultimately, the emergency broadcast was the most important law beat of the final hours. It proved that the prehistoric fire could only be put out by a total erasure. The government had chosen the final solution for the Raccoon City problem. The survivors were the only ones who could challenge the narrative of the accident. The warning was the signal for the final evolution of the resistance. The clock was ticking, and the city was waiting for the fire. The end was a documented certainty. Part 31. Jill's Nightmares. The internal viral war. During the 3 days of her profound coma, Jill's mind became a fractured battlefield where the T-virus fought against the chemical intrusion of the devil vaccine. She experienced a series of feverish hallucinations that merged her traumatic memories of the Arklay mansion with the relentless pursuit of the Nemesis. These nightmares were a documented byproduct of the viral strain, attempting to rewrite her neural pathways, while the cure worked to stabilize her genetic code. Her psyche was trapped in a perpetual loop of fire and shadows, reliving the moment the prehistoric fire first claimed her teammates. The clock tower was a silent ward for a woman fighting a war inside her own skull. Just the visions were characterized by a distorted reality, where the architecture of the mansion bled into the burning streets of Raccoon City. Jill saw the faces of the fallen STARS members, their voices distorted by the static of the failed municipal network. The Nemesis appeared in these dreams not just as a physical predator, but as a symbolic representation of the corporate inevitability that haunted her career. The parasite attempted to integrate itself into her subconscious, seeking a mental host to match its biological dominance. The fever was a clinical struggle for the survival of her human identity against the industrial mutation. The vaccine acted as a tactical barrier within her blood, isolating the viral load and preventing the total necrosis of her brain tissue. As the chemical agent neutralized the pathogen, the nightmares shifted from chaotic terror to a cold, analytical clarity. Jill began to see the patterns in the organization's research, piecing together the disparate clues she had gathered during her isolation. The coma was an accidental period of intense data processing, where her mind categorized the corporate crimes while her body recovered. The trauma was the price of the immunity she was slowly building. Her subconscious relived the injection moment repeatedly, the biological spike serving as an anchor for the viral intrusion. She felt the cold spread of the NE-alpha parasite's influence, a sensation of being watched from within her own nervous system. This internal surveillance was a documented feature of the advanced strain, which sought to monitor the host's stress responses in real time. Jill's resilience was a clinical anomaly that the virus struggled to overcome. She was an individual who refused to become a statistic, even when her heart rate was a flat line in a Gothic courtyard. The nightmares finally began to dissipate as the vaccine achieved total dominance over the local infection. The fire in her mind was replaced by a sterile, freezing cold that signaled the stabilization of her vital signs. Jill's psyche emerged from the viral fog with a singular focus on the destruction of the pharmaceutical giant. The dreams had hardened her resolve, turning her fear into a directed weapon of retribution. She was no longer a victim of the incident. She was a survivor who had looked into the abyss of the prehistoric fire and returned with the truth. As her consciousness returned, the last image she saw was the sunrise over the mountain ruins of Resident Evil 1. This symbolic closure was the final act of her internal recovery, a sign that the mansion was behind her and the city was her final mission. The 3 days of silence were a necessary incubation period for the veteran officer. She was waking up in a world that was already scheduled for erasure, but she carried a strength that the organization had not intended to create. The coma was over, and the final 72 hours were approaching the end. Section 6, October 1st, The Last Hours, Part 32, 3 minutes past midnight, The Final Awakening. At 3 minutes past midnight on October 1st, Jill Valentine regained consciousness in the relative safety of the clock tower interior. She found herself physically weakened, but biologically cured, the vaccine having successfully purged the concentrated T virus from her system. Tyrell Patrick was waiting by her side, monitoring the federal emergency frequencies that confirmed the final status of the city. He informed Jill that the sterilization operation was in its terminal phase, and that a tactical missile strike was less than 6 hours away. The time for recovery was over, and the time for the final sprint had begun. The atmosphere in the room was one of absolute technical urgency. Tyrell utilized his hacking skills to display the digital countdown on the municipal monitors, a visceral reminder of the Reaper falling from the sky. Jill realized that her 3 days of unconsciousness had left her at the very edge of the city's existence. The infrastructure was gone. The police were dead, and the only remaining objective was the retrieval of the vaccine samples from the underground facility. Every minute spent in the tower was a minute closer to total vaporization. The silence of the Gothic halls was now a psychological weight. Tyrell's report included the intelligence that the military had established a primary extraction point at a secondary laboratory known as Nest 2. This facility was the heart of the organization's local production and the only place where a completed vaccine could be synthesized in bulk. The survivors had to reach this location and secure the cure to justify a delay in the missile strike. Jill accepted the mission with a clinical focus, her tactical training overriding the physical trauma of the infection. She was a professional who was moving toward the final confrontation with the corporate machine. The move toward the basement was a high-stakes gamble against the clock. Jill navigated the ruined courtyard where she had first fallen, noting the absence of the Nemesis. She understood that the Predator was likely undergoing a mutation or repositioning for a final intercept at the lab. The 24-hour warning was a reality that echoed in every distant explosion. Raccoon City was a hollow shell that was being audited by the federal military. The survivors were the only loose variables in a clinical plan of erasure. The morning light would bring the fire. The presence of Tyrell provided Jill with the technical support needed to bypass the high-security gates leading toward the hospital basement. He acted as the watchdog, she monitoring the perimeter for signs of the corporate cleanup teams. They moved through the shadows of the downtown district, avoiding the remaining necrotic swarms to reach the industrial elevator. The city was a biological graveyard that was preparing for its funeral. Jill felt the weight of the vaccine in her blood, realizing she was a living proof of the organization's failure. The final hours were moving at high speed. Ultimately, the awakening at 3:03 a.m. was the signal for the end of the 1998 era. Jill was the last STARS member in the impact zone, a witness who refused to be silenced by the virus or the missiles. The mission to Nest 2 was the definitive act of the resistance, a race to save the truth before it was reduced to ash. The clock tower was left behind, a Gothic relic that would soon be erased from the map. The survivors were descending into the dark one last time to find the light. The countdown was a digital heartbeat in the dark. Part 33. The deal with the military. The race for the cure. A secret arrangement was coordinated between the remaining survivors and the Federal Military Command overseeing the sterilization operation. The deal was a clinical trade. If Jill and Carlos could deliver a completed vaccine sample to the evacuation point at Nest 2, the missile strike would be delayed to allow for a full extraction of the research. This was a high-stakes political gamble that ignored the human cost of the city's population. The government wanted the cure to protect their own interests, and Jill was the only tactical asset capable of retrieving it. The deal was a sign that the law was now a secondary concern to biological security. The military moved its primary transport helicopters to the perimeter of the hospital district, waiting for the signal that the vaccine was secure. However, the organization utilized its internal influence to ensure that the survivors faced absolute resistance within the laboratory. They wanted the city destroyed, with the witnesses inside, ensuring that no record of their negligence reached the federal courts. The deal with the military was a race that the corporation intended for Jill to lose. The survivors were caught between a nuclear reaper and an industrial traitor. Jill understood that the vaccine was her only leverage against the total erasure of her story. Without the cure, The government would have no reason to delay the strike or listen to the testimony of a disgraced police officer. The mission to Nest 2 became a struggle for legal survival as much as biological safety. She worked with Tyrell to synchronize their movement with the military's tactical window. Every delay in the lab was a direct threat to the extraction plan. The prehistoric fire was now a political commodity that determined the life or death of the survivors. The deal also highlighted the decentralized nature of the biological arms race. Different government agencies were competing for the research, with some wanting the vaccine and others wanting the data on the Nemesis. Jill realized that she was a pawn in a larger game of international espionage. Carlos acted as the primary liaison with the military, utilizing his guerrilla background to negotiate the landing zones. The mercenaries and the police veteran were the only ones fighting for the truth. The military was merely fighting for the results. The time limit for the deal was absolute and coincided with the sunrise of October 1st. If the signal was not sent by dawn, the missiles would be launched according to the original sterilization protocol. This created an atmosphere of terminal pressure within the laboratory halls. Jill moved through the sterile corridors with a clinical speed, bypassing the biological traps to reach the synthesis room. The vaccine was a purple liquid that held the keys to the future. The deal was a contract written in the blood of the city. Ultimately, the arrangement with the military was the final test of Jill's resolve. She had to navigate a world of engineered death to satisfy a government that was ready to burn her. The mission was a documented proof of the corporate reach, showing that the fire could only be contained by those who were willing to risk everything. The lab was a tomb of high-tech science, where the survivors were fighting for a miracle. The deal was a signal that the time for the city was over. The missiles were already in the air. Part 34. Nest 2. The underground vaccine factory. Nest 2 was a high-security underground facility hidden beneath the Spencer Memorial Hospital, dedicated to the mass production of viral vaccines and experimental biological weapons. While the original Nest beneath the police station was a research hub, this secondary lab was a purely industrial complex designed for the optimization of the corporate products. It featured state-of-the-art synthesis chambers, cryogenic storage units, and an automated security grid that operated independently of the city's power. This was the place where the organization prepared its countermeasures for the global market. The visual language of the facility was characterized by a clinical, sterile minimalism that ignored the chaos of the world above. Jill navigated the corridors, discovering the records of the T-virus production runs and the genetic blueprints for the Tyrant models. The lab was a factory of death that turned the biology of the species into a marketable asset. Every room was a visceral record of the corporate arrogance that had led to the 1998 disaster. Jill realized that the organization had planned for the outbreak from the beginning. The lab was the engine of the apocalypse. The primary threat within the facility was the Nemesis, which had mutated into a massive quadrupedal beast after the trauma of the Clock Tower battle. This form was a documented proof of the NE-alpha parasite's ability to adapt to extreme damage by sacrificing the host's human structure. The creature moved through the lab with a supernatural agility, utilizing the ventilation shafts and the industrial pipes to stalk its target. Jill was caught in a high-tech cage with a god that had outrun its limiter. The Predator was the final guardian of the corporate secrets. Jill had to utilize the laboratory's own equipment to synthesize the final vaccine sample. This required the collection of several chemical components located in the high-risk zones of the facility. The process was a clinical test of her situational awareness as she had to manage the mechanical puzzles while being hunted by the monster. The lab was a laboratory where the history of the species was being rewritten in the dark. Every chemical bypass brought her closer to the cure and closer to the final confrontation. The vaccine was an industrial hope in a world of engineered horror. The facility also housed the remains of the UBCS supervisors who had been liquidated by Nikolai. Jill found the evidence of the internal purge, realizing that the sergeant was erasing everyone who knew the truth of the project. The lab was an archive of betrayal, where the mercenaries were the primary victims. Tyrell provided the technical support needed to bypass the security firewalls, allowing Jill to reach the central hub. The facility was a closed loop of industrial secrets that was about to be erased. The prehistoric fire was fully documented in the basement of the hospital. Ultimately, Nest 2 was the definitive end of the Raccoon City project. It was the place where the organization's ambition met its terminal failure. Jill's movement through the lab was a clinical descent into the reality of the corporate machine. The facility was a monument to the scientific hubris that had burned the city. The vaccine was the only thing that remained stable in a world of mutation. The lab was the final destination for the survivors. The countdown was a digital heartbeat in the sterile air. Part 35. Tyrell Patrick's death. The last sacrifice. The escape through the laboratory hub was interrupted by a final predatory strike from the Nemesis. The creature cornered the survivors in a narrow passage. Its mission parameters focused on the total liquidation of the remaining witnesses. Tyrell Patrick, the technical expert and the watchdog of the unit, realized that the team could not bypass the monster without a tactical distraction. In a final act of selfless heroism, Tyrell chose to engage the creature to buy Jill the seconds she needed to reach the synthesis room. He was the last UBCS member to fall in the city, dying so the truth could live. The death of Tyrell was a documented proof of his professional honor and his commitment to the resistance. He utilized his limited weaponry to strike at the biological god, providing a momentary reprieve for the police veteran. The Nemesis eliminated the hacker with a clinical lack of empathy, its tentacles piercing the tactical vest and the torso of the soldier. Tyrell died in a world of high-tech science that he had mastered but could not escape. His sacrifice was the final nail in the coffin of the corporate military. The watchdog had performed his duty to the very end. Jill witnessed the murder of her ally with a visceral sense of loss. Tyrell had been the eyes and the ears of the resistance, providing the intelligence needed to challenge the organization's control. His death left Jill and Carlos alone against the super soldier and the missiles. The laboratory was a cold and silent witness to the sacrifice. It had its automated systems recording the performance of the biological weapon. Tyrell's blood was a clinical record of the price of the prehistoric fire. The survivors moved forward with a heavier heart and a more focused mission. The loss of the technical expert meant that the survivors had to rely on their own skills to bypass the final security gates. Tyrell had provided the necessary codes before his death, ensuring that his mission was completed even in his absence. His legacy was the path that led to the vaccine and the Helipad. The organization had successfully liquidated their most dangerous internal witness, but they had failed to stop the message he carried. Tyrell Patrick was a hero who died in the dark of a corporate basement. The fire had taken the hacker. The sacrifice of Tyrell provided the researchers with final data on the Nemesis's combat effectiveness against a trained human operative. They noted how the creature utilized its superior physical output to overwhelm the target. The data link was the only thing that remained of the watchdog's life. The laboratory was a graveyard of high character and failed hopes. Tyrell's death was a signal that the time for the city was over. The survivors were moving toward the final confrontation. The Reaper was in the hall. Ultimately, the death of Tyrell Patrick was the emotional core of the laboratory mission. It proved that the human element remained stable even when the city was melting. His sacrifice was a clinical rejection of the organization's nihilism. Jill honored her ally by reaching the synthesis room and securing the vaccine. The watchdog had given his life for a miracle, and the cure was in her hand. The lab was a tomb for the men who fought for the law. The final hours were moving at high speed. Part 36, Nikolai's full reveal. The supervisor and the bounty Nikolai Zinoviev finally confronted Jill Valentine in the heart of the laboratory, delivering a full reveal of his mission as a supervisor. He explained that his primary objective was the collection of combat data on how the biological weapons performed against elite human targets like the STARS unit. Nikolai had utilized the urban apocalypse as a clinical laboratory, recording every death and every mutation for the corporate archives. He admitted to killing his fellow supervisors to ensure that he was the only witness capable of selling the data to the highest bidder. The sergeant was a predator who had outgrown the corporate leash. The reveal included the information that there was a massive bounty on Jill's head, placed by the organization to ensure her total liquidation. Nikolai viewed Jill not as a human being, but as a high-value commodity that would secure his financial future. He spoke of the prehistoric fire with a clinical detachment, seeing the virus as a product rather than a curse. The sergeant was a being of pure industrial greed who thrived in the atmosphere of engineered horror. He was the definitive face of the corporate betrayal. The laboratory was the stage for his final professional audit. Nikolai utilized his tactical position to manipulate the environment, ensuring that Jill remained vulnerable to the mutating Nemesis. He saw the survivors as the raw material for his report, she recording their struggle with a mixture of professional assessment and personal curiosity. The sergeant was a ghost in the machine who possessed the keys to the city's end. He was a human reaper who was more dangerous than the monsters in the dark. The betrayal was total, and the target was cornered. Nikolai was the master of the laboratory. The psychological impact of the reveal was a documented factor in the final engagement. Jill realized that her entire struggle had been a managed test for a global market. The organization had used her friends and her city as fuel for their research. Nikolai's words were a visceral proof of the company's absolute hubris. The survivors were being processed like animals in a slaughterhouse. Jill's resolve hardened into a directed weapon of retribution. She intended to destroy the data and the man who recorded it. The war was personal. Biologically, Nikolai was interested in how the vaccine would affect the host's performance during the final mutation stage. He monitored Jill's vital signs, noting the stabilization of her genetic code. The sergeant was a clinical auditor who was preparing to close the book on Raccoon City. He had successfully bypassed the law and the military to reach the heart of the conspiracy. Nikolai was a man who believed that the fire belonged to him. The laboratory was his kingdom of blood and iron. The reveal was the end of the line. Ultimately, Nikolai's reveal confirmed that the organization's reach was absolute. They had built a system where even the heroes were utilized as biological assets. The sergeant was the physical manifestation of the corporate rot, a man who had traded his soul for a high-level security clearance. Jill was a survivor who was fighting for the truth in a world of lies. The final hours were a visceral clash between the human spirit and the industrial machine. The lab was a cage where the Reaper was waiting for the final data point. Part 37. The vaccine, stolen, the lost miracle. During the confrontation in the synthesis room, Nikolai utilized a high-caliber shot to strike the floor near Jill's feet, causing her to drop the completed vaccine sample. This was a clinical maneuver designed to secure the miracle for his own profit. Nikolai seized the purple vial with a professional focus, intending to leave Jill to be destroyed by the missile strike while he escaped with the cure. The loss of the vaccine was a catastrophic tactical failure for the survivors. The only weapon against the prehistoric fire was now in the hands of the traitor. The miracle was lost in the dark. The theft of the cure provided Nikolai with a unique leverage in the global biological market. He understood that the vaccine was worth more than the city and the laboratory combined. By holding the sample, he had successfully outplayed the organization and the military. The sergeant moved toward the helipad with a cold confidence, leaving Jill and Carlos to face the mutating god in the basement. The industrial spy had secured his prize, and the witnesses were officially disposable. The laboratory was a tomb that was about to explode. Jill felt the weight of the betrayal with a visceral intensity, because she had spent the last 72 hours fighting through a city of horrors to find a cure that was now being stolen by a corporate assassin. The loss of the vaccine meant that the deal with the military was compromised. The missiles were still in the air, and the time for extraction was reaching its biological limit. The survivors were moving through a world where the fire was winning. The stolen miracle was a sign of the total collapse of the human mission. The Reaper had taken the light. The theft also signaled the start of the final mutation for the Nemesis. Without the threat of the vaccine, the creature was free to expand into its most horrific form. The organization monitored this transition with a clinical interest, recording the spontaneous generation of the biological mass. Nikolai viewed the scene as a successful conclusion to his report. He had the cure, the data, and the extraction point. The survivors were merely the fuel for the coming fire. The laboratory was a furnace of engineered horror. The stolen sample was the final secret. The vaccine was a stable and effective platform that could have saved thousands of lives. In Nikolai's hands, it was merely a commodity for the highest bidder. This clinical irony was not lost on Jill, who realized that the organization valued the result over the process. She had to find a different way to stop the monster and the traitor. The loss of the sample was a catalyst for her final tactical evolution. She was no longer a victim. She was a hunter of the corporate elite. The vaccine was gone, but the fire was still burning. Ultimately, the theft of the vaccine was the most dangerous moment of the final act. It proved that the prehistoric fire was managed by men who sought to become gods. Nikolai's greed had outpaced the viral evolution. The survivors were left in a target zone with zero ammunition and zero hope. The stolen miracle was a documented proof of the organization's absolute reach. Jill stood in the synthesis room, her eyes fixed on the path to the helipad. The final confrontation was a high-stakes gamble for the future of the species. Part 38. Nemesis. Final form. The railgun and the termination. The Nemesis underwent a final, catastrophic mutation within the lower levels of Nest 2, transforming into a massive mound of pulsating flesh and biological tentacles. This form was the absolute limit of the NE Alpha parasite's expansion, a being that had consumed its own skeletal structure to maximize its size. The predator was no longer a mobile soldier. It was a stationary biological fortress that blocked the path to the helipad. Jill was forced to utilize the experimental weapon known as the Fing railgun to blow the monster out of existence. This was the most dangerous fight of her entire career. The FING was a massive high-power railgun that utilized electromagnetic force to launch industrial-grade projectiles at a supersonic speed. It was a clinical demonstration of the organization's secondary research into ballistic warfare. Jill had to coordinate the weapon's charging sequence while avoiding the strikes of the biological mass. The battle was a visceral struggle between the peak of the prehistoric fire and the peak of the industrial age. The rail gun was a heavy hand of justice that required absolute tactical resolve to operate. The laboratory was the stage for the final termination. Nemesis utilized its massive reach to crush the environmental cover, turning the room into a blood-stained kill zone. Every strike from the creature was a documented proof of the viral fire's raw energy. Jill moved with a clinical speed, bypassing the biological barriers to reach the railgun's power nodes. She realized that the only way to stop the god was to vaporize its core. The encounter was a high-stakes trial of human engineering against a biological nightmare. The FING was the only thing capable of matching the monster's output. The final form was a wall of meat that refused to bow. The termination of the Nemesis was a documented success for the industrial purge. Jill fired the railgun, the projectile piercing the biological core and triggering a total cellular collapse within the specimen. The monster was reduced to a cloud of biological debris, its regenerative systems vaporized by the electromagnetic heat. The super soldier was officially liquidated, ending the 72 hours of pursuit. The organization had lost its ultimate life form to a police veteran and an experimental gun. The Reaper was dead on the floor of the lab. The final form was a record of the total failure of the human genome against the NI-alpha parasite. The creature had become an agent of pure biological chaos that sought to consume everything in its path. The railgun was a clinical necessity to neutralize the threat before the missile strike. Jill's victory was a sign of her growing status as an anti-bioterrorism specialist. She had faced the god and emerged as the winner. The laboratory was melting around the remains of the monster. The railgun was the final word on the Arklay project. The destruction of the Nemesis was the definitive law beat of the night. It proved that the prehistoric fire could be put out by those who were willing to use the corporate fire against itself. Jill stood over the wreckage of the Predator, her focus already moving toward the helipad. The super soldier was a memory of a disaster that had redefined her identity. The railgun was a symbol of the human spirit's resilience. The final act was approaching, and the sunrise was the Reaper. Part 39. The Helipad Confrontation. The choice and the shot on the rooftop helipad of the laboratory. Nikolai Zinoviev prepared to flee in a secondary helicopter, carrying the stolen vaccine and the combat data. He was intercepted by Jill and Carlos, initiating a final tactical standoff. The sergeant utilized the hostage situation to maintain his leverage, threatening to destroy the vaccine if the survivors interfered. This was a clinical demonstration of his nihilism. He was willing to erase the cure to ensure his own escape. Nikolai was a man who saw the world as the industrial market, where the human life was a discarded currency. The helipad was the stage for the final choice. Carlos intervened in the struggle, engaging the sergeant in a primal fight for the aircraft. This distraction provided Jill with a singular tactical window to end the betrayal. She was forced to make a choice between the preservation of the vaccine and the termination of the traitor. Jill fired a shot that disabled the helicopter's engine, effectively trapping Nikolai on the roof. However, the purple vial was shattered in the struggle, its contents vaporized by the heat of the facility. The cure was officially gone, and the survivors were left with nothing but their own lives. The shot was the end of the miracle. The confrontation confirmed that the organization had lost its most valuable physical asset. The vaccine was an industrial failure that could not survive the human variable. Nikolai stood on the rooftop, his mission in ruins and his extraction gone. He laughed at the clinical irony of the situation, realizing that the missiles were still coming and that everyone was going to die in the ash. The sergeant was a reaper who had outplayed himself in a city of monsters. The helipad was an altar where the corporate ambition was sacrificed for a final time. Jill's decision to fire was a documented proof of her evolution. She prioritized the destruction of the data and the traitor over the false hope of the cure. She understood that as long as Nikolai remained free, the organization would continue to build their reapers. The shot was an act of directed retribution that terminated the professional life of the industrial spy. Jill was no longer a civil servant. She was a hunter of the corporate elite. The helicopter was a burning relic on a roof that was about to be vaporized. The stakes of the night were officially closed by the destruction of the vaccine. The prehistoric fire remained loose in the world, but the specific archive of the Raccoon City incident was buried under the ruins. Carlos and Jill moved toward a secondary helicopter, leaving Nikolai to face the coming missile strike. The sergeant was a witness who was about to be erased by the very fire he had audited. The helipad was the final sanctuary for the humans and the final grave for the traitor. The choice was made, and the fire was coming. The confrontation on the helipad was the emotional peak of the 72 hours. It proved that the human spirit could not be bought or sold by the pharmaceutical giants. Jill and Carlos were the survivors who had matched the speed of the betrayal. The shot fired on the roof was the first shot in a global war against the red and white logo. The city was a memory of blood and iron, and the survivors were leaving the field. The sunrise was the reaper, and the helicopters were the escape. Part 40, the escape, the sunrise, and the ash. As the sun rose over the burning horizon of Raccoon City, Jill and Carlos boarded a secondary helicopter and departed the urban perimeter. They watched from the air as the federal missiles struck the target zone, initiating a thermobaric explosion that turned the city into a pillar of fire and ash. The industrial violence of the strike erased the laboratory, the monsters, and the dead researchers in a single moment of absolute erasure. The 1998 era was officially closed by a nuclear reaper. The city was a memory of blood and iron. The atmospheric conditions of the escape were characterized by oppressive silence and a high concentration of heat. Jill sat in the aircraft, her eyes fixed on the mushroom cloud rising over the mountain range. She realized that the government had successfully liquidated the evidence of the corporate negligence. Raccoon City was no longer a place on a map. It was a clinical data point in a national security report. The survivors were the only people who knew the truth of the 72 hours. The sunrise was the light that revealed the scale of the massacre. Jill's final words, as the city vaporized, were a documented vow of retribution. She recognized that the organization had escaped the immediate fire, and that the biological war was just beginning. She committed herself to the total destruction of the pharmaceutical giant, a goal that would define the rest of her life. Carlos acted as the pilot of her new mission, providing the tactical support needed to navigate the post-city world. The survivors were the world's first specialists in the prehistoric fire. They were leaving the graveyard and entering the future. The explosion provided a visceral conclusion to the Raccoon City project. It was a clinical reset for the global arms race. The prehistoric fire was loose in the world, but the specific heart of the mutation was gone. The survivors were the witnesses who would tell the story to a world that was still in denial. The aircraft was a harbor of safety in a sky filled with smoke. The sunrise was the end of the nightmare and the start of the war. The city was ash. The escape confirmed that the human element could survive the absolute peak of the viral evolution. Jill was a carrier of the immunity, a being who had looked into the abyss of the NE-alpha parasite and lived. This made her the most valuable biological asset on the planet. The organization would continue to hunt her for decades, seeking to understand the miracle of her blood. The escape was a tactical victory that secured the future of the resistance. The fire was out in the city, but it was burning in her heart. Ultimately, the escape was the definitive law beat of the 1998 incident. It proved that the organization could be challenged by those who were willing to risk everything. Raccoon City was a funeral pyre for the innocent, and the survivors were the guardians of the memory. Jill and Carlos moved toward the horizon, leaving the Reaper behind. The 72 hours were over, and the war was global. The sunrise was the signal for the end of the beginning. BAM Part 41. What each of them did next. The vows and the ghosts. The immediate aftermath of the Raccoon City destruction resulted in a total shift in the lives of the survivors. Jill Valentine honored her vow to take down Umbrella, eventually becoming a founding member of the BSAA, Bioterrorism Security Assessment Alliance. Her career was dedicated to the hunting of the corporate elite and the containment of the viral outbreaks. She remained a ghost of the Arklay incident, a woman whose entire identity was forged in the fire of the mansion and the city. Jill was the world's leading specialist in the prehistoric fire. Carlos Oliveira disappeared into the shadows following the escape, utilizing his mercenary background to operate as an independent actor. He maintained a tactical distance from the government agencies, aware that the corporate influence was absolute. Carlos remained a silent ally to Jill, appearing during high-stakes operations to provide the heavy firepower. He was a survivor who had found his purpose in the resistance. The guerrilla fighter had become a legend of the urban war. His fate was a secret of the post-city world. Nikolai Zinoviev's fate remained ambiguous after the Helipad confrontation. While he was left on a roof that was about to be vaporized, his status as the elite operative suggested that he possessed a secondary escape plan. The organization never confirmed his liquidation, and his data was never fully recovered. Nikolai remained a ghost in the industrial network, a reaper who was always one step ahead of the law. He was the definitive proof that the betrayal was infinite, and the sergeant was a predator who thrived in the ash. The city of Raccoon City was never coming back. The government erased the target zone from the records, turning the mountain range into a restricted area of military research. The population of the city was officially listed as victims of an industrial accident. This cover-up bought the organization the time they needed to decentralize their research. The prehistoric fire was now a global commodity, sold by a dozen different companies on the black market. The war had moved beyond the streets and into the shadows of the global economy. Jill and Carlos's survival was a failure for the organization's cleanup protocols. They were the witnesses who refused to be silenced, their testimony eventually leading to the legal bankruptcy of the pharmaceutical giant. However, the corporate collapse did not stop the reign of the gene. The biological weapons were now a permanent part of the human history. The survivors were the guardians of the truth in a world of engineered lies. The 1998 incident was the preamble to a century of biological fear. The final law beat of the 72 hours was the realization that the nightmare was global. The organization might be gone, but the Reapers were still moving in the halls of the labs. Jill stood on the threshold of her new mission, her eyes fixed on the horizon. She had survived the Nemesis and the missiles, and she was ready for the next phase. The fire was out, but the ash was still falling. The war was absolute,